Thanks for being here today. Today we're going to talk about adultery. And before I get into any of it, I just thought it would be good up front to say that I am aware of the fact that this is in many ways, at least for some people, a sensitive topic. Some of you have experienced this in a more personal way than others. And I am aware of that. Some of the things that I will say, there is nothing graphic in this conversation this morning, but occasionally you're going to hear the word sex. A couple of times you're going to hear the word sexual. And one time I might even use an I word. We'll get to that in a moment. Okay, just one time though. So bear with me. I want you to know that's a possibility, and I gave warning on Facebook and whatnot. So other than that, let's dive right in, shall we? And the reason I'm kind of excited about this is because one might approach. Let's start. How many of you ever heard the phrase, "Thou shalt not commit adultery"? Yeah, everybody. Okay. Generally speaking, when one is talking about exciting sermon topics, this isn't really something that falls top of the list, okay? And yet, as I went into this passage, I said, Lord, I want you to give me something life-giving out of this. I do not want to sit and have a conversation about the darkness of sin and about how we all fail to measure up on some level. Tell me, Lord, that there is something life-giving in this passage. And I'd like to think that that happened. And I started to get very excited about this message, and I'm hoping that I'm able to stimulate some of you in the same fashion. But, so let me ask the question, and this is for married people who were married or are married, okay? In all the time that, at least for the ones who are married, and then you can think about this back when you were married, for all the time that you have been married, did you ever once find someone other than your no hands, by the way, no hands. Did you ever once find someone other than your spouse attractive? Now, I'm not asking you if you've ever cheated. I'm not asking you if you've ever fantasized about some other person, this other person. I'm only asking if there was some other person that other than your spouse whom you found attractive in a romantic/sexual way. Maybe you still do. And it's kind of like I'm squirming in my chair a little bit on that. It's an awkward thing for you to ask me, Scott. Maybe it was the way they looked, some physical characteristics that they had. Maybe it was the way they put themselves together. You know, some people really smart and thoughtful about how they groom their hair, about the makeup they put on, about the clothes that they choose to wear, that sort of thing. Maybe it was how they put themselves together. Or maybe it had nothing to do with looks. Maybe it was their intellect. Maybe it was something to do with their personality, or their wit, or their charm. Maybe it was the way they were kind to other people. Maybe it was the way they bravely faced danger with courage. Whatever it was, the possibilities are many. And so now here's the question, the follow-up question. Did you ever tell your spouse that you found this other person attractive? Is that even a wise decision to make? Unless you're interested in having a fight. Single people. Have you ever found a person who is married to someone else? Obviously not you, or you wouldn't be single. Have you ever found a married person attractive in this way? Chances are, if we took a poll, and you were being honest, almost all, if not all of you would say, well, of course, Scott. Of course. Finding people attractive is a very natural and a very common thing to all of us. But what happens when that attraction becomes a fascination? What happens when it becomes a lingering interest? What happens if it becomes a compulsion? And how do you know when you've crossed the line? And is there some way that we could ever figure out how to stop crossing the line if we knew where that line was? Well, I think that Jesus talks a little bit about that in our passage today. As many of you know, we are in the going through the Sermon on the Mount, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. Today we are at Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 through 32, for those of you who are Bible flippers. And I would encourage you at that point, if you have such device or book, find that passage. Matthew 5, 27 through 32. And if not, as always, it will be up on the screen for you to follow along. Join with me in a word of prayer, please. Only your words, only your will, only your glory. Amen. All right. I'm going to read through the passage in its entirety, and then we'll go back and sort of pick at it a little bit, okay? So starting in verse 27, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. It was said, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Some of you are going, life-giving. That's your goal this morning, Scott, is it? A challenge accepted. Verse 27, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. And of course, everyone listening to Jesus at this time heard it because in Exodus 20, verse 14, the seventh commandment of the 10 commandments, adultery, it says, you shall not commit adultery, plain as day. What kind of definition were they working with when it came to adultery? In other words, when did somebody cross the line of breaking this commandment? This is a cobbled together definition from 3 different Bible dictionaries that I went into, and I tried to piece them together in a way that made it sound like it was making some sense. So you tell me, this is what we're going to work with for this morning. Adultery, to engage in any form of sexual activity or related inappropriate behavior with another person's spouse. In other words, if you happen to walk into a room and you saw 2 people who were beginning the act but had not consummated the act, if you get my meaning, that would have still been enough to be able to grab the so-and-sos by the scruff of the neck out to the town square and begin processes of brutal, judgment and court procedures and all the rest of that stuff. So that's the definition that I'm working with. To engage in any form of sexual activity or related inappropriate behavior with another person's spouse. And you should think about this now, just based on this definition, only this definition. From the time that Moses received it from God and gave it to the people until today, roughly 3,000 years, how many people have broken this commandment? How many people have failed to keep it? And I mean, your mind can sort of fill in the blanks a little bit. It's probably bigger than we think. Okay? Because some people get caught. Not everybody gets caught. Right? Verse 28. What does Jesus have to say in response to, "You have heard that it was said"? He says, "But I say to you." Here we go again. You have heard that it was said, but I say to you. How cheeky. Jesus must think he has some kind of authority. You have heard that it was said, but I say to you. You have heard that it was said from the Mosaic covenant, handed down to Moses by God. But I say to you, wow. Don't lose sight of that. He does it over and over again, but I don't want you to miss sight of the fact that Jesus is throwing the authority card down. That should, even in of itself, before whatever Jesus says, when he says, "But I say to you," that should already be causing some of the people listening to squirm a little bit. Because it sounds like he's challenging the law and the prophets. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. All right, so a couple of things we probably should deal with there. The first thing is the word looks. Okay? I went on a deep dive on the Greek grammar of that word, and that's not just I looked at Samson. Because I just, in this one moment, briefly, for a second or two, looked at him. Okay? That's not what this look is. This look has an ongoing quality to it. If it were to be a little more literally translated, you could say, "But I say to you that everyone who goes on looking," one who continues to look with intent at a woman with lust for her, has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Second word, actually before we get to the second word, let's now talk a little bit. We've talked about sexual attraction at the very beginning, and about how just about every one of us has, we can own some of that at different times in different ways. But sexual attraction versus lust. Lust. Sounds bigger. Sounds like it's got to be more than a passing look, finding someone attractive. Well, in fact, that's true. Lust, I have 3 working definitions, and they all related to each other, and I'm hoping that you're able to pick up on the difference here. The first one, to have a strong desire to do or possess something. Oh, that's a little more than a passing look, isn't it? Okay. 2, to take something that does not belong to you in your mind. What? Let me say that again. To take something that does not belong to you in your mind. Let that soak in. Whatever that is, it's a heck of a lot more than the passing look. It's a heck of a lot more than incidental sexual attraction. Agreed? Number 3, to have incorrect sexual interest in someone. Incorrect. There's probably a better word than that, but that's the one they gave. To have incorrect sexual interest in someone. Mishmash all of that together, and you can start to see the difference between sexual attraction and lust. Lust is filled with intent. And I would submit to you that if we were to wrap it all up, it would be to take something that does not belong to you in a sexual way. Whether that's physically or whether that's internally. What's all the popping going on there? Is it me moving around? What's that? Too close to my face. I'm popping and sputtering. It's usually what it sounds like after coming off the tennis court. It's funny, people. You can laugh. It's okay. It's not that kind of church. I don't know what I mean by that. So we've now articulated this difference between sexual attraction and lust, and that there's this idea of taking something that does not belong to you, that's inherent in what lust is. Okay? So, it says that he has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And it's the phrase his heart that I want to resonate on. It doesn't say her heart. And so I'm going to ask the question, is this teaching just for men? Oh, look at all the heads shaking in the room. Of course it's not just for men, Scott. We're not saying it's okay for women to do that. No, we're not. But that's not my question. Jesus elsewhere has something to say to women about adultery, doesn't he? He sees a woman at the well and he says to her, you've been with 5 men and the sixth one that you're with right now isn't actually your husband. In a roundabout sort of way, I kind of wish you weren't doing that. Another place over there is a woman gets dragged into a court accused of adultery and all the rest of that stuff. Whether she's guilty or not, Jesus says, he who is without sin cast the first stone. They all get sad, run away, and it's just her and the woman left there. And then he says to her what? Go and what? Sin no more. So it's not that Jesus doesn't have a teaching about women and adultery. But you all are shaking your head when I ask you the question, is this specific teaching for men or for women? What is the likelihood that a woman in Jesus' day could take possession of a man to whom she is not married? Now compare that to today. Because that's what some of you are doing. You're translating this to your present day context. Women are probably more empowered today than at any other point in history. The culture has shifted over the centuries in such a way that what women can and can't do today is so much more than what it was back in the day. A first century audience hearing this set of teaching from Jesus isn't immediately going to go to the, oh, he means both men and women. We're just hearing men. No, I kid you not. This bunch hears it exactly for how he's saying it. He's talking to men in this moment. And women are hearing it. And it's not that they don't have something valuable to hear in it, but this specific teaching isn't for them. Why is that? I'm coming to that. This is the part where I tell you the life-giving part is coming, but I'm going to just tease it out a little bit longer. He has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Proverbs 6:23 says, in case you were thinking that I'm somehow saying that women are incapable of this sort of thing, do not lust in your heart after your neighbor's wife, talking again to men, do not lust in your heart after your neighbor's wife's beauty, or let her captivate you with her eyes. Another man's wife preys on your very life. So the Bible gets it. It's not just men being predatory. There's clearly an example of women in a different way being predatory. Why is Jesus focusing his teaching here specifically to men? Let's keep reading. Let's put it this way before I move on, actually. While the teaching that Jesus is giving can apply to all people, do not look with lust upon someone. because in doing so you will have already committed adultery with them in your heart, male or female. That can be applied that way. I'm not discounting it. But I would submit to you that Jesus' focus is on a male-centric, male-dominated culture to whom he is speaking. 99 times out of 100, you were the ones who are guilty of taking something that doesn't belong to you because you can. Society lets you. And then it lets you discard them with nothing more than a measly little piece of paper on any little whim you want. You all need to be called to the mat. So, yes, people don't commit adultery, women don't commit adultery with men, men don't commit adultery with women, men don't commit adultery with men, women don't you get the idea. But for this moment, you men, pay attention. I got something for you. That's what Jesus is saying. So, based on this new definition of adultery, how many people do you think have broken this commandment based on the definition? Understandably, the number is much larger. How many men have taken someone else's wife that doesn't belong to them in their mind? Again, I'm not polling anybody, but it's a good chance that most of the males in the room would have to say at one point or another, that's happened. If you're in doubt, just look at our society. Look at how it's oriented. Look at the things that people are interested in. Turn the TV on. Turn YouTube on. Look at your streaming services. It doesn't take a lot of work. Women aren't surprised. I promise you all the women in the room aren't surprised hearing this, because they're on the receiving end of that. All right, verse 29. It's tougher, it really does. If your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you. For it is better for you to have lost one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off, throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. Eye and hand. I submit to you that as far as males are concerned, the two tools of lust. The third one isn't mentioned here. We're going to come to it in a moment. You're kind of already aware of it, but let's deal with the eye and the hand. Is Jesus really sanctioning amputation as a solution to dealing with lust? Again, a lot of head shaking. This time I'm with you on that. I'm totally with you on that. Here's how I know that, other than the obvious, asked and answered, Scott. Come on. They didn't do it back then. We certainly don't do it today. There's something deeper that communicates that this has to be metaphorical. Imagine that you had a man with no hands and had his eyes plucked out. Is that man still capable of adultery? Is that man still capable of lust? Of course. Of course he is. So cutting off your hand and plucking out your eyes isn't really a solution to the problem. And yet Jesus is kind of making it sound like it is. And so metaphorically, what is he getting at? What is he saying? Your righteousness must surpass that of the scribes and the Pharisees if you wish to enter the kingdom of heaven. Remember our verse from back at the beginning of chapter 5? The verse that I will maintain is the summarizing verse of the entire sermon. What does it mean for your righteousness to surpass that of the scribes and the Pharisees? It means living beyond just the mere letter of the law. It means your heart is deserved of judgment. So when Jesus says, it is better for you to cut off the offending hand or pluck out the offending eye, the first thing that he is doing is he's trying to get your attention. Don't miss that part. Let's not have just a regular garden variety conversation about lust, people. Let me start talking about amputation. Are you paying attention? Your righteousness has to be better than theirs. Their righteousness is based on so-and-so did so-and-so, and who do we drag out into the streets? The woman. What about that guy? Well, there better be a smoking gun in his hand if we're going to drag him out into the streets. Hearsay isn't going to cut it. Okay? The woman being pregnant isn't going to cut it, because we could say that's her husband's or somebody else. The whole deck in this culture is stacked against the woman. The laws are there to protect her, but the way in which they're implementing those laws leave her twisting in the wind 9 times out of 10. Jesus is calling that whole culture onto the mat. Your righteousness must surpass the people who are protecting the law right now. It must be higher than that. You must set the bar so high that your heart is offered up to God as well. Okay? That's the heart of what this metaphor is about. It's about getting somebody's attention big enough to say, it's bigger than your eye and your hand. It's about your heart. Jesus' definition of adultery in these verses, hear me on this, has always been the standard. Jesus is not introducing something new when he says, if you look at a woman with lust, you have already committed adultery with her in your heart. That is not new teaching. That has always been the heart and soul of what adultery was all about, and the laws against adultery were all about. And so that righteousness is the standard for entering the kingdom of heaven. And since most men have failed in meeting that standard, we can even say that many women have failed in meeting that standard. That leaves us then with this question about the fires of hell. We've had that before from the previous week when we were talking about oaths. And we had that with Ryan when we were talking about murder and name-calling and anger and all the rest of that. As the standard exists, if you fail to meet it, you are deserved of hell. You are deserved of eternal separation from God. You are irredeemable because you fail to meet the standard. And Jesus has not yet died on a cross. And so right in this moment when he's teaching this, that truth is real. He's trying to communicate to them, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And the wages of sin is death. That's what this sermon is about. Now, some of you are sitting here saying, Scott, you've gone on for 15, 20 minutes already, and I don't know where the life-giving part of this message is supposed to come from so far. It all sounds terrible. We're all shot. We all don't have any hope according to this. I mean, I get it. What you're saying sounds right. But where's the hope? If my righteousness is supposed to surpass those guys over there, I'm dead on arrival. I maintain to you that the Sermon on the Mount sets the stage for the need for God's grace, not God's punishment. That is the standard, and you can't meet it, so there is a better way. Those are the rules, they are the standard, and that is what righteousness takes. But since you can't do it, what I really want is your heart. You've heard us say it week after week since we started this message. Jesus is redirecting their thinking. You can't meet the standard. It is the standard. It's not going away. But I got a plan. How about you just follow me? How about you just follow my example? How about you figure out what love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself smells like, looks like, tastes like, feels like, sounds like. And then live it. And when you don't, when you drop the ball, I don't want you sitting around waiting for the axe. I don't want you sitting around wringing your hands with guilt and shame. I want you to pick yourself up off the ground that you just fell on, dust yourself off, and say, I give it back to you again, and again, and again, and again. And as long as the heart stays oriented toward God, falling on the ground is not something that comes with an eternal cost. It comes with life costs. We call them consequences. If one of you genuinely commits, the actual act of adultery with someone else and gets caught, chances are you're not going to be married anymore. Family's going to be broken. And you can be restored from that. You can turn yourself around from that, but it doesn't change the fact that there's a string of consequences that come as a result of having done that. That still exists. That's reality. That's, what's the term when they talk about capital punishment being a deterrent? That's the term I'm looking for. Consequences are the deterrent from continuing in that way. Okay? But as far as eternal judgment is concerned, people, you need to wrap your mind around this idea. God has abandoned the idea of punishing you once you've accepted His Son as your Lord and Savior. Once you are a follower of Jesus Christ, the only thing He's doing is moving you to glory. As messy as that might be, as sloppy as that might be, He's moving you to glory. All right, so the first objective, I think, of the sermon is to convince his audience that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God and that the wages of sin is death. But I think the second objective is to give his audience a goal for good living. Now I want you to think about the law from a different standpoint, Jews. I want you to think about it from the standpoint of how am I sitting awaiting judgment from God? And start thinking about it, what's the standard for living? What's the goal? How can I improve myself today? Can I take every thought captive and move away from adultery in my mind? I think that's the message. The message no longer is, if I do this, then what? Jesus is saying, stop thinking that way. You do this or else. Change your mind. Change your thinking. These are here to show you how to live your life. And you ain't going to be good at it all the time. But it's okay. Am I making sense so far? This is the first part of what I would call life-giving truth in a teaching on adultery. But we're getting to the end, and there's one more that I hope you will find liberating. Verses 31 and 32, before we get to the best part. We still have 2 more verses to deal with. It was said, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you, everyone who divorces his wife except for the reason of unchastity, that's a hard word to say, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So up to this point, divorce has always been legislated, but it has never been banned. Okay? Never once has divorce been banned. It's only been legislated. In fact, Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4, and I'm going to read all of it. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house, and she leaves his house and goes on and becomes another man's wife, and if the latter husband turns against her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her to be his wife, then her former husband, who sent her away, is not allowed to take her again to be his wife, since she has been defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land in which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance. Now, you can say what you want about that particular law. We're not going to deep dive on the practical ramifications of this particular law. But I want you to understand something. Jesus is approaching them all knowing that they have taken these 4 verses and turned it into a flying circus. What you have now is a man who, for whatever reason he deems necessary, finds his wife unpleasant in some way, shape, or form, merely needs to scribble his name at the bottom of some ridiculous piece of paper, hand it to her, and cast her out into the street as an adulteress. What does that say? It says, if you hand her a certificate of divorce, this is the part that really I don't suppose I paid attention to, makes her commit adultery. Let's add 3 words to that. Makes her commit adultery against her will. That's what Jesus is saying. Here, have your little piece of paper. Bye. Which means the woman now has 2 choices in life. Only 2. Be a divorced single woman the rest of her days, which is nothing like being a divorced single woman in our society at all. You might as well call her a homeless pariah. She has no finances. She has no protection. She is arguably not even a recognized citizen anymore. She is societally at the bottom of the rung. She's down there with the slaves. That's her first choice. Her second choice is to get remarried and become an adulteress. That's why this teaching is aimed at men, not women. Jesus is calling male-centric, male-dominated culture sinful. It was never meant to be that way. Some of you are like, well, wait a minute, Scott. There's such a thing as, teaching in Paul as the head of the household and, love and lead. And I'm not talking about that. That whole teaching of husbands being the head of a household is a separate teaching for a different day. It is not related to this teaching at all. This teaching is calling undue male dominance, undue male authority exercising sinful. And we're going to prove that by going back to, am I getting ahead of myself? Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll get there in just a moment. Let's keep chiming through here. Divorce for any reason other than adultery, and in that word, by the way, the word adultery used in verses 31 and 32, that is the Greek word porneia. We get a lot of words from that. Porn you should probably be familiar with, but porneia in and of itself has a much larger context of being sexual immorality of all kinds. But within the context of divorce, they would be talking about that specifically as adultery. So some of your translations probably don't say unchastity. They probably say adultery or maybe even sexual immorality. Divorce for any other reason other than adultery is a case where the husband is causing his wife to commit adultery against her will. And we've talked about women in the first century there. Jesus is again going after the males. What is the standard? We're not unpacking divorce in mass teaching here today, okay? There's a lot to be said about divorce that isn't really brought up in this passage. This part we're interested in is that divorce leading to adultery part, okay? Divorce for any reason other than adultery causes your wife to commit adultery against her will, and 2, marrying a divorced woman is committing adultery. That is what this teaching says. That is the standard. That's what Jesus is saying. How many of you, Jesus says, listening to me right now, have broken this standard, have failed to meet this standard? To say nothing of us today. We live in a lot more relaxed society today. Divorce is like business proceedings for some people. This is how Jesus defines the Mosaic statutes on divorce. It is a much higher standard than the current divorce anyone for any reason with nilly-willy intent. How do we apply this today then? Because a lot of people come to me and say, Scott, what's your position on divorce? What's your position on remarriage? That's an involved answer, certainly beyond the parameters of our morning. But my point is that because it's on many hearts and minds, we do at least have to ask the question, how do we apply what Jesus is saying here today? No hands up at all. Again, just answering the question in your mind. How many in the room are currently married to someone who is either not their first spouse or their spouse that they're married to today had a previous marriage? In other words, somebody is a second-timer or a third-timer or whatever. No hands. Just think about that. God's standard is that he hates divorce. It's people not making good on a covenant vow that they made. So divorce, for reasons beyond adultery, that's not the standard. But does that mean that God is demanding that the divorced couple come back together? And if so, why allow for divorce then in the first place? If the only objective for a married couple who gets divorced or separates is to reconcile with one another, why have, from the Mosaic law, divorce proceedings at all? And Jesus says about this elsewhere, that is a concession made because of your weakness. And some people take that to mean, well, then I guess I shouldn't be weak. That's not what Jesus is saying. You are weak, and so you need a concession. God didn't put that there by accident. He didn't put that there and later said, oh, I went and made a mistake when I did that one, didn't I? It's there with good purpose. It recognizes that we're weak. Okay? So let's first take the guilt, shame, and judgment ball and just throw that out the door. We are only focused on good living with no judgment. Okay? If you follow the logic in your head, there are only 3 choices for a divorced person, biblically speaking. Well, and even then, what I mean by biblically speaking is it addresses 3 different possibilities. One, if you are divorced, number 1, you reconcile with your spouse. Does that happen, by the way? Some of you are living proof of that. Okay? 2, remain single. 3, remarry someone else. Again, I'm not going deep down the rabbit trail on remarriage today. This sermon is only addressing, Jesus doesn't really address the issue of what happens afterward. Don't lose sight of where Jesus is. Men, you are causing women to commit adultery against their will. In order for them to survive in this society, they are now going to have to latch themselves onto another man. And you did that, divorcing male. He is taking on the blasé, nonchalant attitude that men in this society have toward women in general. And that takes us to the final thing that I wanted to get across to you today. Turn, if you will, in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 1. That'll be Genesis 1, verse 27 and 28. I want to paint you a picture this morning about the original plan in regards to the relationship between men and women. I'm not talking about specifically husbands and wives now. I'm talking about God's design, original design, for men and women. Okay? And I'm not talking about it. God's talking about it. We'll let his word do the talking. Verse 27. God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, singular. Male and female he created them, plural. Well, right in the middle of the sentence, he just has a change there. Did you catch that? God created him, comma, semicolon, whatever punctuation you want to use. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." So there's a few different things that God is commissioning male and female to do. Where in those two verses do you find the man in charge? Can't find it. It's not there. Fascinating, Scott. What are you getting at? Colin's in the back over there going, "Oh, the egalitarian pastor is about to lose it again on the congregation there." We get into it, him and I, all the time on this topic. It's actually not exactly the same topic, but let's keep going. I want you to now one chapter over, Genesis chapter 2, verse 18. I don't think I put it in my notes, but it should be up on the screen. Then the Lord God said, "It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make him a helper suitable for him." Helper. I need you to know something about that Hebrew word. The vast majority of time that Hebrew word is used in the Old Testament, it is referring to God being a help to people. He is your ever-present help in time of need. That is not a subjugated helper. That is not a lower-level assistant. My wife is not my personal secretary. We need to make a helper suitable for him. Some translations take the word suitable out and say corresponding to him. Two halves of a whole. Where do you hear the man's in charge there? Yeah, a rib came out of the man, and God took the rib and fashioned the woman, and then Adam named her Eve, and the only reason he did that is because he was out of the man. She came. Does that mean he's in charge? Because he named Eve? That's really hard to interpret that way. So where did things change? Well, you got to go one more chapter over. Genesis chapter 3. And that would be Genesis 3, verse 16. And we find the first moment where this idea of authority shift changing. God says to Eve, he's pronouncing the curse on the serpent, on the woman, and on the man. Okay? After they have eaten the fruit. He says to the woman, "Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you." The ruling of men over women, I'm making a distinction between husbands and wives, the dominance of men over women in society from day one, or day whatever that is a result of the fall. It is a curse on society. You can't tell me that Jesus isn't aware of that when he is having this conversation with men and women on the Sermon on the Mount. Men, you have been treating women this way, and you have been doing so because of the curse. But that doesn't make it right. What you have been doing is a phrase that we use today that they didn't really have back in the day, and I'm hoping that this phrase is familiar with you. Men, you have been objectifying women for the purpose of your gain, for the purpose of your pleasure, for the purpose of your position, your status, your self-interest. You have been objectifying women. You have turned them into objects of lust. You have turned them into objects of convenience. You have turned them into objects of labor for yourselves. This is all throughout history, people. This shouldn't be news to anybody. Jesus, in his teaching on adultery in the Sermon on the Mount, is doing more than teaching on adultery. He is saying the right relationship between men and women has been corrupted, and you are living it out like a bad drama. How do we deal with all of this? Hearing this. When the answer comes back to what I think the Sermon on the Mount is all about. If you want your righteousness to surpass that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you must let go of trying to obey the rote letter of the law, and you must start denying yourself, taking up your cross, and following me. I'm the one. Turn your eyes on Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in his light, in the light of his glory and grace. What Jesus is saying is, your righteousness surpasses those people when you follow me. I will show you what right looks like. I will show you what love looks like. I will give you the grace and the freedom to mess it up as long as I have your heart along the way. Don't give up on me. I won't give up on you. And even sometimes when you do give up on me, I still won't give up on you. Adultery is objectification. That's what adultery is. And we live in a society where objectification is a largely male-driven act. That is why Jesus is calling the men to the mat in this moment. This is one last little side note, and then we'll close in prayer. We were at Life Group this Tuesday. Our group met in Coaldale. And in that discussion, was me, my Uncle Dave, and about 6 ladies. So, I kid you not, there was vibrant discussion. Vibrant. And it went in a number of different directions. And one of the things that was said was the idea of the modest dress of women. And I want you to hear something. There is some teaching in the Bible that talks about women being modestly dressed, and it is a teaching that, again, like so many other things I've mentioned this morning, goes well beyond the parameters of what we can do. But the reason it was brought up was that if some women today in our culture didn't intentionally, flagrantly present themselves in such a provocative fashion, in such a potentially sexually titillating fashion, that we might help reduce some of the male bad behavior that's going on in society. I want to talk about it as 2 very different things. Should women dress modestly? I think a biblical case can be made for women dressing modestly in society. But I'm holding it way over here, separate from the thing that we've just talked about today. Jesus did not, in any way, shape, or form, say to women, stop flaunting it, gals. So then some guys are like, yeah, but Scott, The young guys, especially, like the young adult guys, will frequently tell me, you know what it's like sometimes walking into a room and there's a whole sea of women and they all look a certain way and they're shaped like that and they got clothes and smells and what am I supposed to do? I ought to walk around with blinders on my eyes everywhere just to keep from falling down. I don't think there's any example of Jesus walking around with blinders on his eyes. I don't think there's any example of Jesus averting the look. I don't see Jesus running away in terror from scantily clad women. I have two examples to give you. One, the woman at the well. He's at a well at the time of day when it's known that those dirty people, the Samaritans, come to the well. It's a time when arguably, some historians will tell us, they will come and turn tricks at the well. This is the street corner, potentially, in our modern day context. The red light district. I don't know how solid that history is, but there's things that have been written about it. And he's going there. That's why his disciples are like, you want to do what now? And he's like, don't worry about it. You go off to town, get what I tell you to do. All is good. Okay, Jesus, you're Jesus. It's all good. But you hear there's a tone there, concern, that he's going by himself midday to a place where dirty Samaritans hang out. Not only did Jesus not avert his eyes or run away in terror when the woman showed up, but he decided to engage her in some serious conversation. And the end of that conversation is, and I can make the argument, and I think it's pretty solid, she became a bona fide Jesus follower that day. And she immediately began to spread the good news about him. The other example, not quite as obvious, but a woman who had been caught in adultery was brought into the court. We talked about her already. And the part I want to pay attention to is that when everybody left, Jesus stayed alone in the court with an adulterous woman. If I said to my wife, Brigitte, I'm about to now go spend some time alone with an adulterous woman, probably going to be a hard conversation. Okay? Jesus is doing that. Why is that? Here's the part, when I said that this is a life-giving message, here's the part I want you to take at the end of all things here. Jesus did not see women as objects to be lusted after. But in fact, Jesus saw, and in fact, we use the phrase skin-tight dress at our life group. The woman in the skin-tight dress. And there are many guys who wish they could see through the skin-tight dress with their little x-ray glasses and creepy little things like that. I submit that Jesus wasn't trying to see through the skin-tight dress. He was trying to see past the skin-tight dress. Because past the skin-tight dress, there is a woman who God created. And when he created her, he said, she is very good. She is fearfully and wonderfully made. And I have poured my image into her. And she has the potential to change the world through Jesus Christ. And you want to objectify her. Why? Jesus says we need to stop that. Rewire your brain, men. When you see a woman who is dressed inappropriately, quote unquote, consider the possibility that there's a human being behind that inappropriate dress. Consider the fact that there is a child of God waiting to be born inside that dress. And what she needs is for you to see her and love her as you love yourself. I believe all of that this morning is what Jesus is unearthing in a simple teaching about adultery. It has so much more to do with than marriage, adultery, divorce. That's there. That's on the surface. But Jesus is after bigger fish. He's after your hearts and minds. Join with me in prayer. Lord, there's a lot here. Sometimes you say so much in such few words. And I know for myself, I have only begun to grasp the depth of what you're trying to teach us about relations between men and women in our society. And yeah, it definitely starts with taking a look at your standard for adultery and realizing that that is a worthy goal to live toward. Avoiding it, rising above it, looking past it. But it affects everyone in the room, married and single. As each of us have the standard set before us, see the person in front of us as a whole person and not part of a person. As a creature of God and not some object to be lusted after. Reshape our minds, rewire our thinking, continue the work of sanctification in each of us that we might come to look and sound and smell like Jesus Christ to people who come our way. In Jesus' name, amen.